My name's Josh Barnes. I'm a pastor. This is Justin Barnes. He's not a pastor, but he's a great brother in Christ, and he knows his Bible. This is the show where we look at political issues or whatever the issues from a biblical point of view. We do that because Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, and that proves that the Bible is true because Jesus said so. And if the Bible is true, we can't be right about issues unless we're biblical about them, or at least not in disagreement with the Bible. And so that's our premise for the show. In case you're just joining us, we've actually tried to start recording this particular episode several times, and so there's a little behind the scenes that we've been joking about here. But we're finally starting. We're actually starting the episode. Here we are. And today we are continuing with our series, refuting some of the crazy statements that have been made on TikTok in response to, what's her name? Oh, it's Miley Bankston, who asked the question on TikTok, tell me something that's not in the Bible, but people think that it is. Here's some of the ones we've done. You can go back and watch some of our responses to these.
Tell me something that is not in the Bible, but people think it is.
That people think that Lucifer means Satan.
Stop telling people their loved ones are in hell because they committed suicide. That is not in the Bible.
I know. White people.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
That preserving America is a priority for God.
Speaking of which, the Messiah. Jesus is not the Messiah. The Messiah is not in the Bible.
Long hair, white Jesus.
Nowhere in the Bible does it say that the devil runs hell. The devil doesn't send people to hell. God does.
Oh, I got a good one. Only God can judge me.
Heaven and hell are not in the Bible.
God helps those who help themselves. It says nothing of the sort.
Well, God will never give you more than you can handle.
When we die, we do not go to heaven.
The devil is not in the Bible.
We have to worship Jesus. We should worship Jesus. No, this is not in the Bible.
Jesus, all the apostles, and Paul never talked about eternal conscious torment.
The birthday of Jesus was never mentioned. At no point does it say December 25th.
Scripture nowhere talks about a woman seeking out to terminate a pregnancy.
So most of these we've already done, and we've kind of, I think we've hit them out of the park, to be very honest. I think we've really just showed that these are mostly ridiculous, although some of them are actually correct. Some of them we've come down and said, yes, the Bible actually, this isn't actually in the Bible. You're correct about that. And then some were a mixed bag, but we still have several more to do. And Justin, you're going to love the one that we chose today. I think I already actually mentioned it to you before we started recording. But this is the guy that you saw on there who said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John weren't actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which would make them not actually Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Tell me something that is not in the Bible, but people think it is.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Furthermore, they were not written by eyewitnesses. For one, Jesus' disciples were illiterate. The literacy rate at the time was about 9%. It even explicitly says in Acts, at least in regards to John and Peter, that they were illiterate. The Greek word there is agrammatori, literally translates to unlettered, like they did not know the alphabet. Aside from that, they would have spoke Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. Not only were the gospel authors literate, they were pretty well educated. They were very familiar with the Old Testament, as well as Jewish law and customs of the time. On top of that, the gospels were written 30, 40, 50, and 60 years after Jesus' death. They were essentially narratives that were formulated around the teachings of Jesus that were passed down via oral tradition. And a lot of those narratives very closely parallel a lot of the narratives in the Old Testament. My favorite example is Joseph of Arimathea was a verbatim copy of Joseph in Genesis 20. It's the same exact story, didn't even change the name. Now to be fair, there are narratives that could very likely be historically plausible, but also some that wouldn't be. One example is Jesus clearing out the temple. The temple was about 24 acres big. Jesus wouldn't be able to clear it out by himself. And two, the Roman soldiers were there, and they would have arrested him on the spot if he had done anything like that. All that to say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. We also have no idea what they originally said, especially since we don't have the first full copy of Mark until about 300 years after Jesus' death.
So this is a these are loaded statements that are pop atheist statements for the most part. They are actually not even close to being true. And we're going to try to demonstrate each and every claim here to be false. And this may be a two-parter. If it's a two-parter, great. It means we have to pick less topics for other episodes this week, and we'll save them for next week. We're not afraid of taking our time. We're just going to get this done, get it right. Justin, first thoughts.
Yeah, pop atheism. This guy probably listens to Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman, for sure.
And a lot of those kinds. But the funny thing is, if he does, then he would know even Ehrman wouldn't make some of the claims he made, because Ehrman knows to make a statement like we don't even know what the Gospels originally read is historically laughable. Like that is one of the most implausible things you could possibly claim, is that we don't know what the original reading of the Gospels were. And Ehrman wouldn't make that mistake. This guy, clearly not a scholar, probably just regurgitating what he's heard from
Ehrman certainly suggests as much in the content that he puts out. So if you're listening to Ehrman,
he will try to let you believe that.
Yeah,
he will try to let you believe that without actually saying it, because he knows if he actually says it, he would look stupid.
Yeah. And we'll address that specifically when we get there. So let's take it one piece at a time. But yeah, Ehrman does make you think that. By the way, for anyone who wants more on Bart Ehrman, I found a really helpful YouTube channel. It's called the Ehrman Project. Ehrman Project, EHRMAN Project, PROJECT. That's the name of the channel, Ehrman Project. And it's actually youtube.com/user/Ehrman Project if you want to find the actual address. And they actually have a ton of scholars respond on there, just responding to things that Bart Ehrman says. And actually, all of these claims are addressed on that channel. It's super helpful, very, very informative, highly recommended. That being said, let's start with one claim at a time. And let's see if I can get to the beginning here. Here we go.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Furthermore,
all right, so that's the claim. He's gonna try to give a little bit of evidence for that. So we'll take this as one big piece. So let's continue.
Or they were not written by eyewitnesses. For one, Jesus' disciples were illiterate. The literacy rate at the time was about 9%. It even explicitly says in Acts, at least in regards to John and Peter, that they were illiterate. The Greek word there is agrammatori, literally translates to unlettered, like they did not know the alphabet. Aside from that, they would have spoke Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. Not only were the gospel authors literate, they were pretty well educated. They were very familiar with the Old Testament as well as Jewish law and customs of the time. On top of that, the gospels were written 30, 40, 50, and 60 years after Jesus' death. They were essentially...
Okay, so we'll stop there. So he's basically saying that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could not have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because, well, first of all, they're going to say that they don't claim to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But, of course, they do, actually. John and Luke do claim to be written by John and Luke. But he's going to say it could not possibly have been John. At least John and Peter, he says, were illiterate. According to the book of Acts and I think it's chapter 3, where they are looked on and said they are unlearned men. The Pharisees perceived these to be unlearned men. And he says, well, that means they couldn't read or write, so they certainly couldn't have written the Gospels. The problem is that Peter certainly may have not been able to write. That's possible. He was a fisherman. He may not have needed to. But here's the thing. Acts chapter 6, let me read you a passage from Acts chapter 6. This is when they ordained deacons in the church to help take care of the matters of the church. But the reason they got deacons to help take care of matters while the apostles continued with the study of Scripture is said in verse 4, but we will give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the word. Meaning they needed all of their time spent in prayer and study so that they could learn the Old Testament Scriptures better, so that they could probably learn to read and write better. All of these things were things that they dedicated themselves to. Maybe they weren't very learned in them at first. But even if Peter wasn't, Peter didn't write until very much later in his life. John didn't write until much, much later in his life. Luke was a physician, a very learned man, and he claims to be the writer of the book of Luke. And Matthew, of course, being a tax collector, would have been very learned. Peter also didn't write the book of Mark. Peter gave Mark the instructions, and Mark wrote the book of Mark. And on top of that, Mark, if you ever do any study on Mark, Mark has a an Aramaic dialect to his Greek. He almost writes with an accent. He uses Aramaic type words and forces them into the Greek language, or he forces his Greek in a format that would be more Aramaic, kind of like if a Russian were to write, like when you get those emails from the Nigerian prince. It's kind of like that. So you do have all of that evidence that he's saying we should have. We actually have it about the Gospels. Justin, I've been talking too much.
Well, first of all, Josh, don't you know that if at one point in your life you don't know how to read, you're never going to know how to read ever in your life, ever, period? Here's the thing. Even at best, what he could have proven, if we want to give a lot of weight to the argument he made about Peter and John there in Acts, which means accepting what the Pharisees were saying about them, which I'm not sure is really the best ground to put your foot on. But let's set that aside for a second. He picked two of the latest writers in the entire New Testament. So from the point in Acts where they're called ignorant and unlearned, I believe that's in the same passage where it says they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. And these were just a bunch of ignorant rubes is more or less what the Pharisees were saying, which sounds like a smear campaign to me. But hey, let's say they were right. You took two of the people who wrote the latest in the entirety of the Bible. The Gospel of John, commonly accepted to be the last one that was written. Revelation, clearly one of the last books written in the New Testament. The epistles of John, probably after his Gospel, is my guess. You have Peter is writing towards the end of his life with 2 Peter, maybe using an amanuensis, which, by the way, there's a whole nother layer to this, is that Peter very well may have used an amanuensis for both of his Gospels, because the grammar is certainly different. So maybe he wrote one, had an amanuensis for the other, or maybe there was someone writing for both. But the problem is,
it is really
all
interesting.
of this sort of stuff.
It is really interesting. Just to pause there on Peter real quick, because what I know you're making a conclusion that's great, but Peter, in Mark being written so early, Peter trying to give his story actually gave it to Mark to write down. And Mark wasn't probably an expert writer, but he did a great job. He may not have been the most versed person in Koine Greek, but Peter seems to have been a less apt writer. So he had Mark write it. And then later on in his life, Peter seems more apt with letters and with Greek. Like this is something that he learned later on.
Yeah. And here's the thing, is like there's 5, 6, 7 different possibilities as to how you could get around this guy, perfectly legitimate answers as to how that could be not an issue at all, even if he's right, which I think he's way overstating the case from that phrase in Acts about them being unlearned. But even if we grant that, there's no way I can grant this any sort of weight, because there are just so many ways that you can get around this. I mean, they wrote it later. They learned to read and write, or they used. I mean, Paul, a lot of his books he spoke and someone else wrote down. So like, even if we grant everything he claims on a factual basis, which I don't, but even if we do, it still doesn't give me a problem, because I know a little bit about the historical context of the day. Granted, I don't grant him the weight, but the other thing is, I'm sorry, you're going to have to do better than this if all the historical evidence that we have from the first couple centuries says, yep, that's where that came from. They called it the Memoirs of the Apostles when it comes to, I believe it was Justin Martyr who talks about the Memoirs of the Apostles, talking about the Gospel records, talking about, I forget who it was, but they called it the fourfold form of the Gospel, which was the 4 books. So the early church had no questions as to the authorship on this. Yeah. They knew. They didn't have questions. You have countless early books, real quick, you have countless early books that cite these books as scripture, Clement and other writers. If you want to do this and give an honest argument to someone who actually knows the context, you're going to have to put a lot more effort in, because this is pop atheism. It preys on ignorance.
Yeah. What you were saying, Justin, I want to drill in more on those other historical sources. So in case people are unfamiliar, the Bible is not just proven by the Bible and by my belief, by my faith. right? The Bible itself is eyewitness testimony, or at least testimony that claims to be eyewitness testimony. Then we have to back up and say, okay, if this book claims to be written by John, which John did claim to write the book of John, and Luke claimed to write the book of Luke, Mark and Matthew did not claim their books. They wrote them, they didn't claim them. How do we know that Mark and Matthew wrote Mark and Matthew? And how do we know that John and Luke really wrote John and Luke? Well, there's a lot of different ways that historians do this, but one of the ways is by looking at what other people wrote near that time. And there was one guy who lived between 60 AD and I think it was 130 AD. So he was born he was a young child when the books were being written. And he actually knew and was a disciple of John because John lived all the way to the 90s AD. So this guy's name was Papias, and we don't have a whole work remaining of Papias, but we do have what people in the 2nd century wrote after reading Papias's stuff. They copied some of it down. And Papias made it very clear that everyone knew that Mark and Matthew had written Mark and Matthew. That these two, that Mark had written the Gospel of Mark, and that it had been as Peter had given him as Peter was his source for the information he got it from. And then Matthew had written his gospel specifically to the Jewish people and in a Jewish way that Jews would understand. So Papias, as early as during the time of the disciples, was already writing about, this is Mark and Matthew that did this. And then Irenaeus also spoke of all four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being written by them. So and others. So these are actually proved. And what I think is really significant is the names that they chose. I mean, think about it. If Mark wasn't written by Mark, and it was written by someone else who wanted to just claim that this was historical and that you should listen to it, why in the world would they choose the name Mark for this gospel? Mark was a nobody. He wasn't around for Christ. He wasn't there. He's a nobody in the church. If somebody wanted to write a fake gospel and put a name on it, they would use one of the names of the apostles. Of course, they would use Peter. They would use one of these other names, but they didn't. They used Mark because it was true. The fact that they used a name that they would never have used unless it was true proves that it was true.
And you want to know the proof of that? Because we have those other fake books called the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. We have these books. We know that when people wanted to appeal to the authority because they wanted their book to be circulated as, this authoritative book from God, they stole Thomas and Peter. They didn't steal Mark. Mark makes no sense.
Yeah. By the way, Luke wouldn't make sense either. Faking a Gospel of Luke would make zero sense.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, Papias, when you talk about church history, Eusebius cites Papias. And I want to preempt this because I know some people are going to say, well, Eusebius is citing Papias, and he says, well, the epistles of John weren't written by John. Yeah, but if you read what Papias actually wrote, Eusebius just misread what he wrote, because it's plain as the nose on your face that Papias was saying, yes, John, the apostle and presbyter, because he's both, wrote the epistles to these churches too. So not only does Papias confirm the Gospels, he also confirms the epistles of John as well.
And it also confirms that Eusebius accurately recorded what Papias had written, even though it contradicts what he was trying. The point he was trying to make.
Even though he misunderstood it, because I don't know how he botches it, but what Papias says is pretty obvious. He just, I think, jumped to an assumption. But either way, the historical verifiable nature of these documents, it's really not that hard. And that's why I say this stuff, this pop atheism, it preys on ignorance.
Yeah.
Because this guy, he's confident, and if you don't know this sort of stuff, you haven't put in the legwork, I can see it being convincing. But if you know anything about the first couple centuries, this isn't that tough.
Yeah, and I know we're getting for the surface level people who are watching for surface level stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That's fine. If that's what you want to get from the show, great. whatever you want to get from it, that's what you're going to get. But I know we're getting a little bit into the weeds for those people, and I get it. We're trying to show you that there's so much information here. There's so much study. Do not accept these type of claims just because someone sounds smart to you. There is a lot more information that you need to consider before you just throw out the Bible because somebody said that it was, wasn't actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's ridiculous. We actually have just so much historical evidence for the accuracy of Scripture.
Here's a good principle to live your life by. Don't overturn your worldview based on a TikTok video. Because I guarantee you, no matter what, they have not been able to give you the whole story.
Yeah.
So maybe this guy was just trying to summarize and he has lots of citations behind this. Doubt it. My guess is he'll probably cite other sources like the Bart Ehrmans of the world. But either way, if you actually know the context, the history, some of the early materials, because I love the early church, but there's a lot of stuff out there, so I'm not going to pretend I know all of it. But even with just a bit of knowledge in the early church, this one's not hard to shoot out of the sky.
Yeah, let's pick up from there and see what his next claim was.
They were very familiar with the Old Testament as well as Jewish law and customs of the time. On top of that, the Gospels were written 30, 40, 50, and 60 years after Jesus' death. They were essentially narratives that were formulated around the teachings of Jesus that were passed down via oral tradition. And a lot of the...
So 30 years after Jesus' death, why would that be passed down via oral tradition? Yes, it is true that 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death is when most of the death and resurrection, by the way, is when most of the Gospels were written. That's because they didn't need to write them down. Everyone could just talk to the apostles to find out, or to the other 500 plus people who saw Jesus risen. And so, but as people started to die and they started to realize, okay, we're going to need to write this down for the next generation. That's when they wrote it down. So it was 30 to 40 years. But in the 60s AD is when most of the Gospels were written. We do have the Gospel of John written probably in 85 AD. So that would have been, that would be about 50 to 60 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. But that's not like another generation. That's when the apostles are still alive. And the fact that he's saying it's written so far out that it had to be oral tradition is ridiculous. The apostles are still alive at that time.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that it's oral tradition, you could probably make kind of an argument for that on Mark, because again, this isn't Mark as an eyewitness writing. This is Mark writing what Peter and possibly even Mary, because there are some scenes from Mary's perspective.
That's mostly Luke, so, but yeah, I think that is in Mark a little bit.
I think there is some in Mark as well, but anyway, but I know Luke definitely does, because Luke is a historian. Luke and Mark are not the direct eyewitnesses claiming to have this. They are, yes, gathering, I guess you could say, oral tradition, but they're gathering it from eyewitnesses. We're not talking about an oral tradition that's been passed down generation after generation after generation. You're talking about a grade A historian in Luke getting eyewitness testimony for Theophilus, whoever Theophilus is, in both Luke and in Acts, and he's doing a very good job of documenting it.
And Mark and Luke cite their sources. Luke even says in Luke chapter 2, when you're reading the Christmas story, he says, "And Mary kept these things and pondered them in her heart." Why is he saying that? Because he's saying, that's how I figured it out. Mary kept it and told me. And Mark, from the very beginning, the very first chapter of Mark, he jumps right into Peter's story to tell you that this was Peter who's giving me the information. And at the end of Mark, he reminds you again, oh, go tell the apostles and Peter that he's risen from the dead. Like he keeps mentioning Peter over and over to let people know that's my source.
And by the way, what's this argument of they were very familiar with the Old Testament? Duh.
Of course they were.
That was kind of their thing. You don't have to be literate to be very familiar with the Old Testament. What do you think the seat of Moses was? That was where they taught the law of Moses. The Old Testament was kind of a big deal to the Jewish people in the first century. So even if we wanted to go with this whole, the apostles weren't literate, but yet they somehow knew the Old Testament. How did those darn first century Jews know the Old Testament? That was their thing. That's what the Pharisees were there for.
Especially especially following Jesus, you can imagine not only their Jewish upbringing is very much centered around the synagogue where they would read the scriptures and where they would be taught these things, but then with following Jesus for 3 years, and Jesus dies and rises from the dead, and then they say, we're going to dedicate our lives to the study of the scriptures and to prayer. Of course, they're going to know the Old Testament. I mean, of course.
Also, and I don't know if he got to this point yet or if we haven't gotten there yet, but when he says they would have spoken Aramaic, but the Bible was written in Koine Greek, yeah, the spoken language of the area was Aramaic, but actually the written language was more commonly Greek. That was the language of trade. So the only book that some people hypothetically think was written in Aramaic would be Matthew, but outside that, the written language, the most common language to read in, was common Greek, Koine Greek. So
I think
that's just a simple misunderstanding of the first century.
Does he mispronounce?
He says Koinian, which I've never heard
Koinian?
before. Koinian or something like it's Koine Greek or
But again, I mispronounce stuff all the time, so I'm not going to give him a hard time about
Right,
that.
right,
but
I wasn't
it doesn't
gonna rag
make
on him
him
for
look
that.
smart, just to be honest.
Well, I'll put it this way. I don't know that if you've actually taken a class in Koine Greek that you would call it Koinian Greek or something like that.
Right.
Because I took 4 semesters of Koine Greek, so I know is Koine. Because that's how,
that doesn't make us Greek scholars by any stretch. But we did take a little bit of Greek.
No, what I'm saying is, it does actually give you, when someone mispronounces stuff a lot, it does give you an idea that maybe they haven't heard a professor pronounce it a whole lot.
Right.
Just a thought.
Yeah, that's true. Now we're running out of time, so we're gonna have to make this a two-parter. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, I think we'll just put this all together as one big one. I don't know. We'll see. But if you're watching on FISM TV or wherever else, we're going to take a break, come back at it tomorrow. Or if you're listening on KSAR Conservative Radio Network, you only have to wait for about like 2 minutes. Most of our breaks are 2 to 3 minutes on KSAR. But however you're watching, we will pick this up and finish going through this issue. But before we do, before we end this half of the response, I want to remind you guys that our show is sponsored by White Mountain Munchies. This is the big bag, White Mountain Munchies. These are resealable containers. They have it's trail mix, but it's healthy. It's gluten-free. It's non-GMO. This one's Grayson's Getaway Goodies. It's got macadamia nuts, coconut pieces, cashews, organic dried goji berries. I mean, like all kinds of stuff. It's really, really good. And we don't make money from this. It just keeps our show on the air. So you can go to White Mountain Munchies. That's whitemountainmunchies.com. And use the promo code RAM. That's RAM, R-A-M, for Right America Media, RAM. And you get a great discount. You get amazing food. It's a win-win, win-win. We really appreciate you guys supporting the show like that. And with that, we want to remind you to be biblical about everything, or you're not going to be right about everything. And we'll see you next time on Point of View. And we're right back. This is Pastor Josh Barnes and Brother Justin Barnes. This is the show where we're unashamed to look at political issues from a biblical point of view. This is Point of View. And we are going to continue our response to, by the way, I never gave, in our last episode, I never gave the name of this guy, or at least the TikTok name. His name on TikTok is Captain Dadpool 86. Captain Dadpool 86. And he says that he's an atheist with a bachelor's degree in theology. He's a stay-at-home dad and a professional opinion haver. And so he has a bachelor's degree in theology, which is just enough to make you think you know things, but not quite enough to actually know things, apparently. So his claim is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't actually write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's watch the video again, and then we'll dive into the second half that we never got to in the last episode.
Tell me something that is not in the Bible, but people think it is.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Furthermore, they were not written by eyewitnesses. For one, Jesus' disciples were illiterate. The literacy rate at the time was about 9%. It even explicitly says in Acts, at least in regards to John and Peter, that they were illiterate. The Greek word there is agrammatori, literally translates to unlettered, like they did not know the alphabet. Aside from that, they would have spoke Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. Not only were the gospel authors literate, they were pretty well educated. They were very familiar with the Old Testament as well as Jewish law and customs of the time. On top of that, the gospels were written 30, 40, 50, and 60 years after Jesus' death. They were essentially narratives that were formulated around the teachings of Jesus that were passed down via oral tradition. And a lot of those narratives very closely parallel a lot of the narratives in the Old Testament. My favorite example is Joseph of Arimathea was a verbatim copy of Joseph in Genesis 20. It's the same exact story, didn't even change the name. Now, to be fair, there are narratives that could very likely be historically plausible, but also some that wouldn't be. One example is Jesus clearing out the temple. The temple was about 24 acres big. Jesus wouldn't be able to clear it out by himself. And two, the Roman soldiers were there, and they would have arrested him on the spot if he had done anything like that. All that to say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. We also have no idea what they originally said, especially since we don't have the first full copy of Mark until about 300 years after Jesus' death.
Okay, so if you want to know our response to the arguments against Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, check out our last episode, or if you're watching it as the one long episode, then just rewind a little bit because you should have already seen it. But we've already dealt with half of this. We've talked about the fact that there's lots of historical evidence, other authors in the first century who talk about these books as being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. At least Mark and Luke would never have been claimed in a false way. Nobody would claim that Matthew wrote this gospel if they wanted it to be, if they wanted people to pay attention to it, or excuse me, Mark or Luke. Because Mark was a nobody. He wasn't an apostle. He had no authority. Nobody would claim him as in a false way, right? The fact that they chose his name means that it was true. Otherwise, no way they would have chose Mark or Luke. Now, even Matthew and John, we have writings from the first century. From I think it was Plebeius. Who was it? I'm sorry. I'm blanking on the name. Who was Papias? Yeah. Papias. Plebeius. Papias even wrote from the first century or even the early second century that it was Matthew who wrote the book of Matthew. And John claims he wrote the book of John. Papias knew John. We had people from the second century who say, yeah, John wrote this book. John died in the 90s. So we've talked about all of this. We've given all of the evidence that says that the gospel records certainly could have been written by the people who they say they were written as, and we've also given the historical evidence that proves that they certainly were written by the people who say that who we know wrote them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now we're talking. Justin, do you have any other summarizing things about last time before we jump into his claims for the second half of the video here?
Just to reiterate, just don't let confidence itself be what persuades you, because people can be really confidently wrong, and that's all that this would be, because it's not deep, it's not really good arguments, but he's confident, and I can see that persuading some people.
Yeah, and so some people heard him and maybe heard him on TikTok and thought, I know he's wrong, but I have no idea what the arguments behind him being wrong are. And that's really the service we're trying to provide here. We're trying to help you. Actually, this was sent to me by my producer, Juan, who's a Christian, and heard it and said, no, he's wrong. He's definitely wrong, but I have no idea why. And that's why he wanted us to go through it. And I think there's a lot of people who feel that way. They want to hear that explanation. So we're giving you truth here. And we're actually, point of view today and yesterday, have been just proving that the Bible certainly is true, so that way we can use it as this foundation and standard for our worldview. Let's listen to the next couple claims he makes in the second half here of this episode.
They were essentially narratives that were formulated around the teachings of Jesus that were passed down via oral tradition. And a lot of those narratives very closely parallel a lot of the narratives in the Old Testament. My favorite example is Joseph of Arimathea was a verbatim copy of Joseph in Genesis 20.
Justin, do you have any idea what he's talking about?
Honestly, I have no clue, because I have Genesis 20 pulled up right now. I'm thinking maybe he said the wrong number, because there's this Genesis 20 is Abraham and Abimelech with the whole Sarah thing, and I have no idea what he's saying. Like, none. Joseph of Arimathea. Josh, would you like to tell us who that is?
Jo- yeah, Joseph of Arimathea is just the guy who opened up his tomb for Jesus to use. So Jesus was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And now there was a guy in Genesis, is it in Genesis 20 that gives Abraham his tomb for Sarah to take? Is that what he's talking about? Is it in Genesis 20?
I don't believe so.
No, that's before Sarah dies.
Yeah, this is before Sarah dies. So
okay, Genesis 23.
Yeah, so in 20, this is just Abraham and Abimelech, and Abraham says that his wife is his sister, and Abimelech takes her, all that sort of stuff. That's the Genesis 20 thing. So I have no idea what the parallel would be in Genesis 20. Again, if he just misspoke here, I don't want to just dunk on someone making a misspeak, though he did put it out there as a confident argument, but I have no idea what point he's trying to make if Genesis 20 is what he's saying.
Okay, but Genesis 23, Abraham is Sarah dies, and Abraham is looking for a place to bury her, and he's going to buy a burying place from Ephron, and Ephron says, "No, I'll give it to you," and Abraham says, "No, I want to buy it," and so he buys it and buries Sarah there. That's nothing like Joseph of Arimathea, who did actually give the place for Jesus to be buried, and it's not the same name. I don't see any parallels between Joseph of Arimathea and even Joseph later on in Genesis. It's his favorite. So, and here's a tip for people out there: when you want to debate with atheists, what you want to do is ask them for their best example of something. If they say there's all kinds of contradictions in the Bible, say, give me your best examples of contradictions in the Bible. Because they're just going to keep popping up with new ones and new ones and new ones. What you want to do is say, if I can show you that your absolute best examples, quote unquote best examples, are wrong, then we can have a discussion and get past this. Because otherwise you're just going to be in the weeds the rest of your life. You're never going to get past it. So if this is his best example of the New Testament authors just repackaging Old Testament stories, then I'm sorry, this is a terrible example. Because there's nothing here at all. There's no parallel whatsoever.
Yeah, and let's take this one a step further, shall we? Let's say that there is a story where some Joseph, which this is not Joseph, it's not, but let's say there's a story of some Joseph who, there's a guy who's publicly executed, and Joseph gives a grave for this guy. And maybe this guy was dying to, I don't know, save a village or something. Who cares? Let's hypothetically say that does exist. So, who cares? Number one, that doesn't say anything about the historical nature of either claim. It's like saying, because here, I'll give you one. Watch me destroy Christianity in like half a minute right here. There's a story in the Old Testament where a father takes his son onto a mountain and has him there as a sacrifice, and then there's a sacrifice presented, blood is spilt, and then once that's done, this father takes this guy Eliezer, whose name means comforter, and sends him to go get a bride for the son. Come on, guys. The New Testament authors were just totally stealing the Old Testament narrative. I mean, the father, the sin of the world is laid on Christ, and the wrath of God is poured out on him. And then as Christ comes back, the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, is sent to gather the bride of Christ. Come on, they just stole the Old Testament story. Anyone can do this. It's like there is foreshadowing in the Bible. We know that. We're cool with it. That's okay. That doesn't say anything about the historical nature of the book, though. Not one thing.
Yeah. And I'm smiling because, Justin, you taught me something new. I was unfamiliar with Eliezer's, the meaning of his name. That is so cool, you know?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things about studying the Bible. You can study it your whole life and still be learning new things. That's really cool. That's a great, just not a story I had dove into in that depth. But yeah, there's so much foreshadow. As a matter of fact, all of the Old Testament is meant to foreshadow the New Testament. I mean, you have that's part of the proof of it. I mean, look at how specific the requirements of the tabernacle and the temple were. The worship was exactly a picture of Christ and what Christ did and what Christ did on the cross in atonement. It's an amazing picture. It is so amazing that it proves that it's true. But he's trying to turn around and say, "Oh no, they were just even lazy. These were super intelligent guys who knew the Old Testament. They just copied the Old Testament and made up a New Testament." It's laughable. It's silly. That would not have lasted until today. The early Christians were very concerned with what was actually true. This is an important point because Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if he didn't really rise from the dead, then all of our belief, all of our faith is in vain, all of our preaching, none of it means anything if it's not true. It is so important that this is actually true. And the reason that we have so much evidence from the first and second centuries, or actually really mostly from the second and even into the third, of people talking about the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so on and so forth, Clement of Rome and Irenaeus and others. We know this because they were debating what was true about these things right from the start. So if somebody had written false narratives that were just reusing Old Testament stories, this would have been, somebody would have come up with this idea and made that accusation back in the 2nd century, because these debates were being had immediately. But now Captain Dadpool has come up with it thousands of years later when nobody ever thought about it when it was actually written. That's ridiculous. Nobody thought that this was a fake story when it was written. Everyone agreed that this had to be true, even though they were using actual people in the story and saying you can go, so that they could go check up on it and see if it was false. And nobody thought it was false. Everybody knew it was true. So this is just, it's nonsensical, this argument.
Yep.
Okay, moving on.
The same exact story, didn't even change the name. Now, to be fair, there are narratives that could very likely be historically plausible, but also some that wouldn't be. One example is Jesus clearing out the temple. The temple was about 24 acres big. Jesus wouldn't be able to clear it out by himself. And 2, the Roman soldiers
would have arrested him. Justin, you want to take this one?
I mean, I don't really know.
Did the Bible ever say that Jesus cleared out the temple? Or did he just use words that aren't in the Bible?
I honestly don't know.
Well, let me go to John. I know there's one account of it in John chapter 2. Maybe while I'm going there, you can find another account there. But it says here in verse 16, we'll start in verse 15. When he had made a scourge of small cords, let's back up. Verse 13. And the Jews' Passover was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drave them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. So he literally just turned over, he didn't clear out the entire Temple Mount. He just turned over the tables where there was obviously one central place where they were doing this exchanging. And they were in the temple, they would actually have to use temple currency. They'd have to come and bring their money, turn it in for temple money, and then use temple money to buy temple animals that were approved to be used in the temple. And really they were fleecing people and gouging them with this. And Jesus went to that area of the temple where that was taking place, and he threw those people out. He didn't clear out the entire temple. That's silly. And besides that, it's debated whether the temple was really 12 plus acres large. That was probably more than what it actually was.
Yeah, so the reason I didn't want to speak too quickly is because I wanted to fact check and make sure that he's wrong here, but I don't see anything about him throwing everyone out. I mean, unless you want to think that where the money changers were is the only thing they did in the temple.
Yeah, like
because
spread over the
only
entire
thing.
temple. Yeah.
Yeah. So unless you want to say that, you know, everything, the only thing they did in the temple was the money changing, it doesn't say clear them all out. It just says that he overturned tables and chased those people out.
Yeah, in John it specifically says, and found in the temple, which means they weren't all over. He found them. You know, he found the section where they were. It says,
but you have to.
In Matthew, it says
I was
that
just going to say.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, I was just going to say you have to keep in context what just happened, because he said the whole thing about the Romans would have this, that, and the other. First of all, the Romans wouldn't really have cared. Also, you have to remember what just happened right before this. Jesus comes in the triumphal entry, and the whole city is Hosanna, you know, save now. Some temple, he throws them out. He had the city on his side at that point. This is not a Jesus was going in there with a couple of people out and the whole city was mad at him. No. This was the peak of the support of his public ministry because the people misunderstood what he was doing. But if the Romans had tried to step in, that actually would have been the whole kerfuffle. The fact that Jesus did this, there's nothing implausible following the flow of what's been happening. There's nothing implausible about it.
Yeah, and remember that the Romans didn't want to interfere with the Jewish worship at all. This, to the Romans, this was one Jewish teacher arguing with other Jewish teachers, and they didn't want to get into that. That was not their thing. As a matter of fact, when Jesus was arrested, they didn't want to put him to death. They brought him to Pilate, and Pilate was like, I don't want to have any part in this until the crowd demanded it. So no, the Romans wouldn't have come in and arrested him for overthrowing tables. But to be fair to his position, Justin, Jesus did do this twice. So in John chapter 2, he did it in the beginning of his ministry, and he did it again after the triumphal entry. So it wasn't always in both times at that peak time. But there's also a lot of information about the Temple Mount. So right now, where the Dome of the Rock is, people think that used to be the temple, where the temple was, and that is a giant, giant piece of land. But in reality, if you do a lot of research on this, a lot of people are now thinking that area, that giant piece of land, actually used to be the Roman fort that was built in Jerusalem, and it was next to that where the temple was, and it was significantly smaller. So it wasn't 12 acres of land either. But either way, the place where this was taking place was probably just a very centralized location, probably right at the entrance.
By the way, I just want to make note of this real quick because I've been looking for the source on the Eliezer Comforter thing. I know I have heard this claim before, and I know that a professor of mine in college actually made this claim. I'm not able to confirm it right now.
Okay.
So
well,
I'm going to fact check myself live here because I don't want someone to take that. I am going to double back and make sure that I check my sources because I know I have sources that have made that claim. I'm going to see how historically accurate they are. But just in case, I want to withdraw that. He's still a picture of the Holy Spirit, but just in case, I don't want to make anyone believe it.
To be clear, it is impressive. It's impressive, I think, that Justin's point stands no matter what, because he was just making the point that where things parallel each other doesn't mean that they're necessarily not, that they're false. But even though his point stands, he still wants to be accurate. That's really cool. I'm actually hoping he's wrong because it would make me feel like he wasn't like that much smarter than me and knew this that I didn't know. But anyway.
Right. So in essence, though, you're right. I mean, the parallel is very obvious. The father sends out his servant to get the bride. And by the way, it does say that when Rebecca comes back, that Isaac is comforted because of the loss of his mother. So he is comforted in that. I don't believe that was the claim that was given to me earlier. But like I said, I'll check my sources and get back to you on what I find out.
Yeah, let's finish off his last few claims here.
There, and they would have arrested him on the spot if he had done anything like that. All that to say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. We also have no idea what they originally said, especially since we don't have the first full copy of Mark until about 300 years after Jesus' death.
Okay, we have no idea what they actually said because we don't have the first full copy of Mark until 300 years after the apostles were dead. Did he say after they were dead?
I don't know if he said after they were dead or after Jesus was dead.
We also have no idea what they originally said, especially since we don't have the first full copy of Mark until about 300 years after Jesus' death.
After Jesus' death, which would be 330 AD. Justin, I think having a full copy of Mark is different than having copies of Mark, which I think date to the 2nd century, right?
Bingo. Yeah. So here's the problem. A full copy would be an entire complete manuscript, which is super valuable, but also not the only way you know what a book says. Because let's say you have about a dozen copies of the Book of Mark with various sections. Some of them are going to be missing some sections. So that's not a full copy. So it doesn't count in this guy's mind, except for you still have the Book of Mark. You still have the Book of Mark. You still have the same readings. And when you see another copy later on that has those same readings and maybe a little bit more in a certain portion, then, okay, so this one stopped at, the manuscript decayed and is gone after chapter 12. Okay, well, here's what chapter 13 and 14, and this one in chapter 12 reads just like this other one. Well, we can say, okay, so we see what the manuscript would have kept saying. The thing is, what I want you to understand is what this man is trying to do is stand on textual criticism to try to say that we have no idea what the Bible says. However, he's standing on principles of textual criticism and making claims no textual critic would ever make.
Nice.
Because textual critics know, okay, full copy means next to nothing. What about the papyri, sir? What about all the manuscript evidence that we have before full manuscripts? Just because you want to jump to, I don't know, what, Vaticanus? Sinaiticus? Who cares? You have the papyri that predate that sort of stuff. You have just what we have in Christianity with the Bible, especially the New Testament, is an embarrassment of riches. There is you don't want to let me go on textual criticism for too long because this is we'll never get out of this, but there is absolutely not one leg to stand on to try to make the argument we have no idea what the Bible says. Bart Ehrman, the number one textual critic who is non-Christian, who's against Christianity, he himself, when pushed to it in debate, said, yeah, there might be one reading in the Bible that we don't have the original reading. Did Jesus, was he angry with the guy? Did he like the guy? We maybe don't have the original reading there. Outside that, he says we're just playing with the details. Of course we have the original readings. So this is why I said in the last episode, this guy probably listened to Bart Ehrman and assumed what Ehrman wanted him to assume, but Ehrman himself would not agree with this guy.
Yeah.
The people who know the field of textual criticism, who are against Scripture, would not agree with this guy.
Yeah, to be clear, so this is how we know that anything was ever written in history ever, right? Is somebody wrote it, and if it's far enough back, you don't those papers or the papyrus or whatever it is, those don't last thousands of years. They deteriorate. So unless they were copied and then copied and then copied, then you're not going to get it. The problem is usually one person is going to copy it and you're going to get one copy, and then one person is going to copy that, and then and eventually you're going to have problems. What happened with the New Testament writings is they were immediately copied to send out to churches, and those churches copied to send to other people, and they copied. And so there's so many different copies out there that you can actually compare them together and find out where one copyist may have made a mistake and where one issue is here or there. And like Justin said, it's an embarrassment of wealth that we can now look back and find all these different copies and pieces, a piece here, a piece there, a piece there, mash them together, and we know without a shadow of a doubt exactly what was originally written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not even close to a question.
And let me say this is for people who might be uncomfortable straying into the waters of textual criticism because, oh, no. That's the people who want to question the Bible. When it comes to apologetics on this topic, textual variants are one of the best gifts from God ever. Why do I say that? because we don't have the same issue that you would have, for example, in Islam. And I'm going to be quick because I know we're right at the end of the episode here. But in Islam, they had a compiling of the Quran and then burning. Uthman's revision, I believe is what it's called. Burn the other ones, which they didn't get all of them, but most of them. So you basically have no idea what came before because it was a controlled text. The Bible, the New Testament, because we have so many textual variants, even though most of them don't matter much, what do you have there? That means there was no government over the Bible determining what it said. No secret council of spooky guys in hoods with smoke all over the place. It was just people copying the manuscripts. And what we learned from textual criticism is they did a really darn good job, and we have all the original readings. Just have to sift through some of the...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is great. Now, we've just given you the beginnings of this. So dive into this, do your own study on your own. I'm telling you, this guy is wrong, and provably so, and I think we've done that handily. Justin, do you ever have trouble sleeping at night?
Don't use me for your segues.
That's a great segue, it really is. No, the answer is no, not anymore, right? Tell me I'm wrong. No, guys, go check out. So we were sent free MyPillows. I already had one because I love them. And they sent us extra ones. And because MyPillow is a supporter of the show, and they don't pay us, but if you go to mypillow.com, use the promo code RAM, you get an amazing discount, and they'll know that we sent you, and they actually support the show and help keep our show on the air. We appreciate that. Promo code RAM at mypillow.com. It's amazing. You'll love it. We'll see you next time right here on Point of View.